First of all, I want to say how delightful it has been for my wife and me to be here. I am amazed at the range of countries from which different staff members have come. I won't say, as people often do, what a multicultural place this will be, because I'm very impressed by John Stuart Mill's essay on liberty, and I think the question of what culture ours is can vary as our lives continue and as we are influenced by others, whereas the word multicultural often suggests something static. This has been my culture, so this it will always be. No, I don't think so. But the range of countries from which you or your family have come is immensely impressive, and I was delighted to meet so many staff members yesterday, and I'm very grateful to Adele for that. Secondly, I must say what a marvellous campus you have. It was only fairly late in these 9 days that we're here that I discovered the Strand, this marvellous field. I ran on it this morning, my wife walked to, and you wouldn't get a field like this in any other university that I know of. It is magnificent. Thirdly, I'll say something about hospitality. I'm grateful for what I've had here at International House. But Learningguild, which is an international educational and social movement, puts great emphasis on sustained membership and on hospitality. So, if you're coming to Melbourne, do let us know. We can provide a cuppa, a meal, and perhaps a bed. So do let us know if you come to Melbourne. You'll find addresses and so on in our literature. Now, about our magazine. Margaret has about 40 copies of the most recent issue, which has been delayed, of our magazine that comes out twice yearly, Learningguild Letter. And you're welcome to take one or more. And my editorial letter this time is quite relevant to the question of how you teach reasoning. Finally, in these extempore remarks, I'll just say something about what I'm doing in giving you a script of my talk. It's handwritten because I haven't yet found the need for a personal computer. I think I may well do so in the next year or so. But at the moment, most of my work is done in our home in Brunswick, near a northern suburb of Melbourne, not far from the centre. And so, while I've been here, I've handwritten this talk. Now, I was asked whether I wanted PowerPoint, and I said no. Some of you may know a joke about PowerPoint. Do you know the famous remark of Lord Acton, the English historian, about power? It was, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And one witty academic once said, power corrupts, and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. What did he or she have in mind? Well, a strange change has taken over a lot of academic presentations, to use that rather awkward word. We used, say when I was a young academic, when I first turned from classics to philosophy and became a lecturer in classics, in philosophy at Melbourne, we used to give papers. They were written out. Maybe one had completed them at 2 o'clock the previous morning, but they were expected to be all written out. You read a paper. Some people got a bit bored by the fact that some academics, perhaps especially from the United States, would read their papers in a very dull way like this. And people thought, oh, come on. Whereas one mark of an educated person is to be able to read from a script in an alert and lively and vivid way. It's a skill worth developing. Then PowerPoint came in. And you got the phenomenon which is now common among philosophers, I'm afraid, where people talk to the what's on the PowerPoint. It's not clear whether they're reading it or saying something immensely important or just waffling. And I listen to these things. Of course, some people can do it superbly, but many don't. and I listen to some of these presentations and I think, why didn't you do us the credit of supposing that we would like to hear exactly what you want to say, polished, made more concise, and so on. And I found in recent years that the best thing to do is to produce your script in advance and to give it to people. It lets you go a bit more quickly than you could otherwise. It lets you leave out something occasionally if that seems desirable. And in this particular case, since each of my 5 sections begins with a question, it gives you the opportunity, without having to make notes extensively, to decide what answers you would give to those questions. Well, that's enough of the prolegomena. Let's get going. What kinds of help do tertiary and post-tertiary students need in reasoning and English expression? I think I can get through this script in about 20 to 25 minutes, and that will allow a good deal of time for questions. And I do most warmly welcome any questions. Okay, in this talk, I shall put to you a 5-stage argument and give you a warm invitation. 1. What is involved in genuinely tertiary and post-tertiary study? Here I'm going to draw on an Oxford philosopher who's had a big influence on moral philosophy and whom I had as a tutor in Oxford for a term, and he later became a mentor and a friend. The terms tertiary and post-tertiary are valuable because they have a wider range than undergraduate and graduate, as in graduate student. However, to use R. M. Hare's distinction, whereas the latter pair have purely descriptive meanings, in that, while one is regarded as enrolled for an undergraduate degree, one is, simply on that account, an undergraduate, and correspondingly for the person enrolled for a master's or doctoral degree. The adjectives tertiary and post-tertiary have not only that kind of descriptive meaning tied to enrollment, whether in a university or in a different institution, but also another in which they are partly evaluative. One can use them as I've done in the question that heads this section with the word genuinely, or in the question, does this course deserve to be called tertiary? That question arises in connection with beginners' language courses in universities. I had to begin my study of Greek at the University of Melbourne, that is classical Greek, in 1953 with an intensive 4-week summer course before the normal academic year began. What a wonderful beginning to university study for a 17-year-old. Only then could I enter Greek 1, which was not a beginner's course. I give this answer to this section's question. The adjectives tertiary and post-tertiary are properly applied with evaluative force to inquiry which is normally analytical, critical, and synthesist, ACS. I have explained what I mean by each of those adjectives on page 1 of Learningguild Letter number 2 for 2014, which is on the web, as many of our past issues are. But, as with any other word I employ in this talk, I'm happy to answer any questions about them. I'll just here say that the first four pages of that issue of Learningguild Letter, which are my editorial letter, may interest you particularly because I set out a similar argument to the one that I'm giving today. I explain these words analytical, critical, and synthesist, and I draw on 4 authors, one of whom is David Pennington, a former professor of medicine and vice-chancellor at Melbourne, who's written a very good autobiography called Making Waves, and the other, a much sadder book, has as one of its 2 authors John Cain, who was a Labour Premier in Victoria in the 80s. And afterwards, after he'd retired resigned, he went to Melbourne University to the political science department and worked there for 10 years and was worried by the way the university was going. And so here is a man who was at Melbourne University about 5 years before I was, roughly in 1950 or so, and he and a colleague, a younger colleague, has written a book called Off Course. The university is off its proper course. So if you want to see both something of the glory of Melbourne University, as it was, and of some worrying signs of today, read that editorial letter of mine and maybe go on to Pennington's or Kane's books. It was a characteristic of Australian sixth form or year 12 syllabuses until about 1990 that they took you to the borderland of that analytical, critical and synthesis activity. They seldom do so now. And so most students, native speakers and non-native, are now unprepared for it. I noticed that this complaint about secondary education was made in 1991 by Australian Business Higher Education Roundtable members. Page 2. Before we go on, let us consider two nouns I have used which are often employed unthinkingly: inquiry and study. No course deserves to be called tertiary, let alone post-tertiary, e.g. for a master's degree, if it allows a student, as we used to say sometimes at Melbourne, to get it down, get it up, give it back, rather than to ask questions and strive for answers of his or her own. So inquiry is fundamental to tertiary or post-tertiary study. Of course, one wants it to be known to a boy or girl of 5, but increasingly the inquiry has to be one's own and difficult. Etymologically, the words study and student are rooted in the Latin studium and studere, zeal, and to be zealous. Tertiary and post-tertiary progress hardly deserve the name if eagerness and delight in discovery and cooperation are lacking. So you might say that my overarching question is, how can we communicate and foster eagerness and delight in discovery and inquiry and cooperation? We can properly differentiate undergraduate and 2 levels of graduate study, such as master's and doctoral, as they ought to be, if we distinguish 3 ways in which ACS inquiry can proceed. 1, largely guided. 2A, often independent. And 2B, substantially independent. And that raises what I think is for some people an embarrassing question. Are coursework master's students sufficiently required to show independence? Stage 2. What abilities and what orientation do all students need to have if they are really to be ACS inquirers, analytical, critical synthesists? I speak of abilities and orientation because the commonly used word skills seems to me to have too narrow and impersonal a connotation or suggestion. All tertiary and post-tertiary students need considerable understanding of and experience in applying the questions and principles that underlie thinking, speaking, and writing that is clear and precise, concise and fair. And if I may, I'll give you another abbreviation for that, CPCF. Clear, precise, of course those two go together, concise and fair. And the desire to keep improving in such thinking and in both those kinds of communication. Well, someone may say, there's a counsel of perfection if ever there was. You know, somebody might say, you're obviously not at the cold face of universities these days. 3 kinds of reply may be given. A, yes, I am continuing in the long tradition of what the medievals called the trivium, the set of 3 vii, paths, the set of 3 paths, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Rhetoric, by the way, under the condition that the case that was put was a logical and reasonable one, not any sort of rhetoric, as a necessary set for prospective university entrance. The boys, alas it was only boys, had to show that they were already able in those areas, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. I now prefer to call them sentence construction, reasoning, and choice of words. B, in Plato's Republic, we read that nothing imperfect is an adequate criterial measure of anything. So you set your standard high, though you know that we can only approximate more or less closely to it. And C, I'm asking for enough understanding and experience to give considerable competence, confidence, and determination to go further. Ideals are essential for good education at any level. They stimulate that determination and a persevering patience. Page 3. Do I need to remind you that university teachers as well as students can fail to communicate well, especially in speech? And what a difference it makes if, by contrast, they exemplify clarity and precision, conciseness and fairness? Few students now at tertiary or post-tertiary levels have gained much understanding or had much experience of the questions and principles I have in mind. So, for example, someone does not clearly grasp the difference between asking a question and reporting or embedding one, and writes, we ask them to think about what sort of person do they want to be, question mark. You don't learn at secondary school now, at least in a systematic way, the difference between a direct and an indirect or reported or embedded question. You may have thought fair was a surprising adjective to add to the other 3, or that it's odd to use the word concise about thinking. I'm asking for 2 essential characteristics of the truth-seeking person. An intention to represent others' views or contributions accurately. I must get her right. And to look for both strengths and weaknesses in them. And therefore, some acquaintance with kinds of sound and kinds of unsound argument, preferably in several fields. One radical defect in Donald Trump is his lack of commitment to fairness. As for concise thinking, that is what the company interviewer, who says afterwards, she was quick on the uptake, sees as the great merit it is in business and personal life as well as in study. But concise thinking will often need also to be protracted. 3. What materials effectively help tertiary and post-tertiary students to develop powers of clear and precise, concise and fair thinking, speaking and writing? I begin with a student often enrolled for a master's or even a doctorate, who is a non-native speaker of English and still very weak in it. He or she needs above all to master the sentence structures and most of the words in a dictionary of limited compass, not an electronic one, a dictionary of limited compass that provides illustrative sentences for very many of those words, and therefore to write similar sentences. Hence my recommendation of the Oxford Essential Dictionary and the booklet I've written in relation to it, Sentences to Study and Change, SSC, which is on our website, learningguild.org.au. You'll find a reference to it at the foot of the home page. Many of my students have also needed and benefited from a systematic grammar such as one or other of Raymond Murphy's. On all of this, I invite you to read my editorial letter in Learningguild Letter 1 for 2012, which draws upon the 2 talks I gave in 2 different Chinese universities in 2012 about the special difficulties that Chinese students of English often have. Page 4. At this point, I must bluntly say that one scandal in Australian university education, as one who has been a senior lecturer at Melbourne, valued the university tradition in Australia, it hurts me to have to recognise this. I must bluntly say that one scandal in Australian university education is the failure to diagnose where each incoming student is in written English, and whether or not any related classes or tutorials are or can be provided by the university, at least to make clear and recorded recommendations to such students. For example, of the booklet and books I have just mentioned. So, for example, it would help you to work through all of Raymond Murphy's essential grammar in use, even though he says he doesn't want you to do that. It would be the best thing for you now. Show me in 6 months' time that you've worked through the whole book and done all the exercises. Now, you may say, oh, I'm not very happy about that, but some such recommendation should be given and recorded. Of course, also, you hope that somebody on the university staff will accept special responsibility for each particular person. At Melbourne in 2014, I was asked to help a Cambodian PhD student, but it was his 7th semester, and too late for the ongoing systematic work he should have been required to begin and show progress in his first. These students are often weak in their speaking of English, and that can cut them off from other people. For that, I use my booklet and CD, Sounds, Words, Sentences, SWS, which goes through all the 46 sounds, should they be 47? Another story, set out in the International Phonetic Alphabet. I especially emphasize the needs to pronounce consonants clearly. I ask them to say as they walk around, next week, and to discover the vowels which one finds difficult. Perhaps what I call the kissing vowel in go and most. What of the native speaker of English, who, like most such students in our universities, has been required at school to learn very little grammar, and the non-native speaker at an intermediate level? Here the need is to sensitize and inform, so that the student learns to recognize points at which it's common or easy to go wrong, to understand, remember, and apply principles, and to become able to follow and draw upon a good guide to clear and error-free English, such as Rebecca Gowers' Plain Words, Penguin, 2015, her revision of her great-grandfather Sir Ernest Gowers' famous The Complete Plain Words. My booklet to help students in these ways is QPS, Questions and Principles for Sentence Construction, which reprints my article of that title in Learningguild Letter 2, 2015. Students need to become accustomed both to asking themselves such questions and to determining which of the relevant principles is relevant at a particular point. I provide errors for correction in each of the 13 sections, all of them from a book, a recent book by health professionals. Page 5. Many students have learnt very little about forms of cogent reasoning and ways in which arguments can be unsound. Here my booklet is one called Reasoning, available by post in Learningguild. I would also now recommend my editorial letter on truth-seeking and what is called hypothetico-deductive reasoning in our most recent issue, 2016, of which we bring copies today. And Margaret has about 40 copies, as I said, and you're welcome to have one. So, should there not be, yes, this is a rhetorical question, should there not be a repeatable examination in reasoning and English expression, widely known, recommended and taken, and not tied to any course? That question is first of all a matter of equity. Given that a degree is not a guarantee of proficiency in English, to put it mildly, a non-native speaker of it needs to be able to point to success, for example, an upper B in such an examination, as proof that he or she, I should have written, does have that proficiency. Something wider, deeper, and culturally richer is here preferable to IELTS or TOEFL or the Cambridge test. And it must include assessment of some imagined piece of defective argument and an essay of at least 500 words. This proof of proficiency would greatly reassure an employer who rightly hates the prospect of getting, seeing, or hearing about reports or letters in English that is unclear and or should be full of errors. You know how frequent the reaction is, I might as well have done it myself. All right. Secondly, such an examination would provide every student with a pathway towards excellence in reasoning and expression, especially if accompanied, as it certainly should be, by constructive reports that are themselves CP, CF. By the way, I should mention here that some people among you have probably got a photocopy of our exam leaflet. If you haven't got that, you'll find it on our website at the beginning of the entry certificate. Indeed, you'll see the word here on the copy of the testimonies to our exam. If you go there, you'll find a description of the Learningguild exam, and in particular, you'll see a recommendation of it by a man who's now a partner with Deloitte, Chris Wookie, who's very pleased to have moved up from getting a B twice to getting an A, as you'll see. Thirdly, universities, reluctant as they are, understandably, but with harmful consequences, to impose strict requirements of competence in written English in the tasks they set for assessment, could say to students and to employers that by recommending this examination, for whose results they take no responsibility, they are showing their encouragement and valuing of real and continuing progress in English. 6. Page 6, number 5. Does the twice-yearly examination for the Learningguild Certificate in Reasoning and Expression deserve your approval and support? I'm content here to rely on what you have, the testimonies from Sir Keith Thomas of Oxford, Professor Peter Singer of Melbourne and Princeton, and the late Professor John Silber, President Emeritus of Boston, and to welcome any questions you may have. Well, they're the 5 stages of my argument. And you may well say, well, hold on, I'll have to study what these people have said and I'll look at your exams. And you'll find 5 of them and constructive reports on each on the web. You may especially like to look at the exam paper and the report for May 2014. Although I must admit that in that case, all the candidates were male. One was a young Rhodes Scholar, a brilliant young man, and the other 5, I think, were boys in year 11 at the school that the Rhodes Scholar and I had both attended, Melbourne High School. So you've got a range from a Rhodes Scholar to boys in year 11. The Rhodes Scholar, not surprisingly, got an A in the exam. The boys ranged between B's and C's. And that shows you that this is an exam with a wide range of levels at which people can get the certificate, and the need for many of them to move up to take a repeatable exam. If you ask me, as you certainly should, what level do you set this exam at? I think I would say at about the old matriculation level in Victoria. In other words, the kind of thing that my contemporaries and I would expect you to be able to do. For example, we had work of the kind I keep in section 4 of the exam, where you're given a piece of rhetorically vigorous argument that's full of unsoundness, and you have to explain why this writer has failed to establish his conclusion. Now, at that level, at that stage in school education, the end of year 12, they're asked the question, how does this writer seek to persuade his audience or his readers? What a different question. Okay. Well, now I give you an invitation. I'm going to put it in a surprising way. Is there someone here, or at CDU, or some pair or group of persons who will be a Penny Hutchinson for the Learningguild exam? Penny is a Melbourne woman who has been the CEO of Arts Victoria. Before turning to accountancy, she graduated from London in German and music. I met her in the early 1990s, and she arranged, after an informal test using previous exam questions, for the taking of the Learningguild exam by 31 young managers at the company, BDO, where she was the partner in charge of training, and for me to meet managers who wanted or needed assistance. When she was overseas, other partners put an end to this program, not having her concern for good English. But as you see from our leaflet, whose text is on the website, Christopher Wookey, one of those young managers, on his own initiative, took the exam twice more, and on the third occasion gained an A. With help from others, now including my niece Hilary Howes, a postdoctoral fellow at ANU, who was in 1998 the Australian girl referred to in our leaflet, who got an A at the end of her year 12. I can go on setting exam papers, leading a team of markers, and inviting others to join us, and looking for my own successor. I cannot, however, add to that, and to my continued teaching and writing in philosophy as well as reasoning and expression, the sort of entrepreneurship that might itself attract some candidates. There must be people in particular universities and companies who will play a similar role to Penny Hutchinson's, either by requiring or by strongly recommending the taking of the Learningguild exam, and therefore the use of related materials. And I just said something there in the last paragraph about membership of Learningguild, which I'll leave you to read. I said I would have one further extempore area, and this is it. At the end of May, Professor Ross Garno, who's just been awarded the AO, wrote to your Vice-Chancellor and to Professor McManus and gave me a copy of what he had said. And I think it's worth reading this. Dear Professor Maddox, I spent some time discussing the Learningguild project with Dr. John Howes over the weekend. The Learningguild project and its examination can play an important role in helping Australians, especially but not only Australians, who have grown up in households the members of which do not have high competence in English, to overcome important gaps in their education. I expect that the value might be especially high amongst Australians from Aboriginal communities, which are well represented on your campus. I was pleased to hear that John's been invited to lecture at CDU early next month. It would be good if CDU recognised an opportunity, to take a lead in an area in which Australian education has large weaknesses. An area in which Australian education has large weaknesses. All the best, Ross Garno, Professor of Economics at the University of Melbourne, and also himself Chairman of a renewable energy company in South Australia. I would love to see a combination develop between Ethical Investment Services, a Melbourne company, which has promised me $500 in support of the Learningguild exam, and people in this university, or a department in this university, or the university itself, combining and being able to say, for example, to the Australian Financial Review, we care so much about good English and ability to reason clearly and cogently that we are supporting this exam. Thank you.